He said, "My name is Rowan Hawley, and what I remember most about that Christmas Eve is not the tinsel or the scent of pine. It's the sound of a heavy door closing behind me like a verdict, the metallic click of an alarm arming itself, and the way the cold felt like a judge laying down a sentence. I'd grown up believing that a house could hold a person, that the people inside would be the ones who held me. That night, the house let me go. My father opened the front door wide, enough to swing shame out onto the steps. He didn't look at me with pity or anger. He looked with the practiced blankness of someone who's made a business decision and learned how to tell the truth without trembling. My mother stood just behind him, immaculate, pearls resting at the base of her throat like a claim on the world. Behind them, my sister Serena folded her arms and smiled as though the smile belonged to a stranger who had finally won. "Let's see how you manage tonight," she said, and the words were polished enough to cut. They picked my suitcase up and tossed it onto the frost-slick marble with the kind of casual cruelty that becomes easy when you've convinced yourself you're right. I reached out, fingers numb, and pulled it toward me. For a moment I tried to pretend there had been some horrible mistake, that this was a scene in a film and someone would shout, "Cut," and everyone would laugh and the lights would go on. No one shouted, no one laughed. I walked out into fog so thick it swallowed the streetlights. The neighborhood looked like a photograph from another life, hedges clipped to impossible shapes, lamps that burned a warm, steady gold, houses that seemed to glow from the inside. I watched windows where laughter and the soft light of a family dinner leaked out, and each one felt like a small, private betrayal. I had nowhere to go, no money in my pocket, no car, nothing but the long cashmere coat that had been mine for years, the one thing that still fit like protection. My teeth chattered so hard the sound echoed in my ears. I dragged the suitcase until my legs ached and the wheels scraped over the stone. When standing still felt worse than moving, I kept walking. I walked through yards and past gates, and down a quiet lane until I stumbled into the little public garden by the old church, a place I'd once come as a child to look for shapes in the clouds. There was a single bench beneath a working lamp. The bench was cold and sharp, and suddenly my knees folded, and I let the weight of the night sit on me. I sat there until the tears came and froze on my face. I cried for a younger version of myself who had hidden under the Christmas tree with ribbon in her hair. I cried because I had always believed that earning more, working harder, and making myself useful would secure a place at the family table. I cried because they had rewritten my future like a line item in a ledger and then filmed me as I walked out. The scraping of bare feet on concrete made me look up. She was an old woman, small as a weathered doll, hair the color of old coins, hanging loose around her face. Her feet were exposed to the cold, the skin already the vague, whirring purple of frostbite. She moved as if the wind itself pulled her forward. "Do you know if any of the shelters have room tonight?" she asked, her voice sandpaper and small. I walked from over by the train tracks. "Everything's full." "I'm sorry," I said. I'd been practicing my own apologies in my head all evening. I don't have anywhere either." She lowered herself onto the bench beside me, taking care to leave a polite distance. I watched her breathe, how her chest rose and fell like someone learning to count. I felt that flicker of shame. Here was someone who had even less than I did, and she asked for nothing beyond a question. Self-pity was an ugly thing when you could see it reflected in another face. Her feet were bare. The sight was a hot shame in my gut. Without thinking, I stood and shrugged out of my coat. It was the only warm thing I owned. I wrapped it around her thin shoulders. She closed her eyes at the touch, and then she looked at me. "What's your name, child?" she asked. "Rowan," I said. My voice sounded small in the night. She said it back slowly, tasting it like a secret. "Rowan," she whispered. "Kindness like that is rarer than diamonds." She took my cold hands in both hers and squeezed once. There was a steadiness in the grip, a depth in the look that felt like something sacred passed between two strangers. She rose, gave me a small smile that seemed to hold 1,000 winters, and shuffled away into the fog. I watched her until she was gone. The warmth in the coat itched against me, and yet when I wrapped my arms around myself, I felt strangely lighter. Like giving away the last thing I had somehow replaced something heavier inside me. I slept in a cheap motel that night, the room smelling faintly of stale cigarette and cleaner, the thin lamp humming. I scrolled through job listings until my eyes blurred and tried to pretend the world outside, the motel curtains, was the one that mattered. Around midnight, my phone buzzed, an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't pick up. "Miss Rowan Hawley?" The voice asked, crisp and impossibly professional, with just a hint of a tone that said East Coast private school. "My name is Clara O'Rourke. I'm calling on behalf of Mrs. Agatha Calder. She would like to see you. There is a car waiting." I laughed out loud. The sound startled me, a little hysterical, a little raw. I peered through the peephole and saw 19 black sedans lined up in the cracked parking lot like a motorcade. One of the rear doors opened by itself, and I felt the scene tilt inside me like a book turning to a page I hadn't expected. I walked out in the same jeans and hoodie I'd slept in, shoes scuffing the asphalt. The woman from the bench was in the middle car. She was different, impossibly, dazzlingly different. She wore a long camel coat cinched at the waist, hair smooth into a low, controlled style. Diamonds flashed at her wrist. She was 80 and looked like she'd been airbrushed into her own legend. She smiled at me as if we were old friends. "Rowan," she said, voice soft as velvet. "Thank you for your coat." She spoke as if she knew everything, as if she had been watching a life as though it were a story. We drove through gates I'd known all my life and into a part of town I had only seen from the highway. A 1920s Tudor rose up behind redwood hedges and stone walls, a house so different from the cold, sterile polish in my parents' mansion that it might have been the opposite of a lie. Inside, cedar and rose met us like an old embrace. A hearth, larger than most living rooms, popped and punched a warm orange glow. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked over a private lake that shimmered even in gray. A butler poured tea we did not touch. The room wore silence like a crown. She introduced herself as Agatha Calder. She spoke slowly with the gravity of someone who had learned to choose words as if they were rare coins. Her late husband, she said, had built Calder Commercial Holdings, and then we'd passed. She'd taken what they made and turned it into a foundation that spun off hundreds of millions of dollars a year for causes she believed in. She told me something that made my head swim. That every Christmas Eve for the last 2 decades she had left the estate dressed like someone who had nothing and walked until she found someone who still had a heart when they believed that no one was. Watching. Most nights were disappointing. Most nights she went home feeling that kindness was a story from the past. That night she had found me. Her security team had seen me. They'd watched me check into the motel, watched me cry in the shower, apply for jobs on a laptop, and never once used my act of kindness to get attention. "You are the first person in 15 years, she told me quietly, who gave away the last thing that kept them alive without the slightest look for a camera. I need to know if that was a fluke or who you truly are." She offered me a room. In her East Wing, a salary, and a 5-year apprenticeship. If, at the end of it, I proved to be the person I had been in that bench moment, she would hand me the foundation. Not a gift, she was careful to say, but responsibility. I had questions that stay with people who have been given sudden gifts. Why me? How could she know? But Agatha answered the one that had lived inside me longer than I'd known, because I know what it is to be discarded. I was 29 when my father shut a door on me. I vowed then that if I ever had the chance, I would find the people who looked after another and make sure they were not forgotten. So I moved into the East Wing the following Monday. My new room had French doors that opened onto a rose garden. I could actually smell from my pillow. Clara O'Rourke, tall and steel-haired and efficient, handed me a leather binder the thickness of a small phone book and said with no nonsense, "Welcome to boot camp." Boot camp it was. At dawn, I ran around a private lake under the eye of a former naval officer, who made me sputter through exercises while Agatha's chauffeurs watched with a kind of amused distance. Breakfast was sharp and full of people whose lives had been measured in boardrooms and balance sheets. Mornings were spent at the foundation offices, meetings with trustees, debates about metrics and outcomes that read like a foreign language to someone whose life before had been making ads for products that promised to make people feel a little better about themselves. I learned to read a 9-9 OPF like a novel. I learned how to ask the right questions of grantees so that money didn't soothe bureaucrats but changed lives. Evenings, I drove to Stanford's executive program for nonprofit leadership, where I sat between people twice my age and learned how to measure impact the hard way. Weekends were site visits, battered women's shelters where mothers spoke with raw gratitude about free emergency housing, after-school programs where a paint-splattered coat meant dinner and homework space, veteran housing projects in the valley, where the men and women who had served were trying to piece back together civilian lives. I listened. I rewrote the grant forms until they could be read by a person with 2 hours and a kid in the back seat. I wrote rules so that decisions could be fair and fast. Agatha read every draft and swam her red pen through my sentences. She made me defend my choices in front of a full board until my hands shook and my voice found its steadiness. There were nights I fell asleep at the kitchen table with my forehead pressed to spreadsheets, and mornings I cried in the shower at the thought I didn't belong. Every time I nearly quit, I remembered the bench and the woman in my coat. That night became a North Star, a small, simple test that had told me who I wanted to be. Months passed. Work sharpened me. I learned how to say no when a senator asked for a pet project and how to fire a grantee who'd lied without causing a headline. I learned the bureaucratic art of making big compassion run without wasting a cent on vanity. Agatha's favorite line, "We don't give fish, we buy the river," became my mantra. She enrolled me in workshops, paid for tuition, pushed me into rooms I never imagined I would occupy. Then, one bright June morning that smelled faintly of lemon and old paper, Agatha slid a cream folder across a mahogany table and stood. Inside was an employment agreement. The title read, President and Chief Executive Officer. Calder Family Foundation. The numbers on the page made my mouth go dry. A base salary that felt obscene to say aloud. Equity in the endowment that sounded like numbers pulled from a fairy tale. The clause was clear. I would report directly to the board, to Agatha herself, but in practice the foundation would be mine to run, if I proved I could steer it. She looked at me with something like gravity and tenderness braided together. "I didn't bring you here because you gave away a coat," she said. "Anyone can be generous when a camera is nearby. I watched you for 5 months. I watched you fight for a shelter when bankers argued for line items. I watched you take a folding chair in Oakland and listen to a teenager until midnight. I watched you change a policy so transgender kids wouldn't be turned away. You have the mind I need and the heart I thought I'd lost." She asked me to sign. I couldn't find the words at first. There was a part of me that still felt like the girl on the bench, undeserving and stunned. But when I slid the pen across the paper, it felt less like taking and more like accepting a responsibility I had been preparing for without knowing it. We toasted that night on the terrace with an old bottle Agatha had saved for a celebration she could have simply given herself. We watched the sun bleed behind the redwoods, and she said, softly, to the person who chose kindness when it was inconvenient, I became president in name and in practice. The foundation shifted focus. Faster grants, shorter applications, mandatory site visits. We bought buildings where services should be, not institutions that look like shrines to help, but living places where people could start again. We funded training programs that taught skills rather than dole out tokens. We pushed policy at city halls so that emergency housing didn't require a thesis, and bureaucracy. The work was brutal and exalting in the same breath. I stayed up at night cross-checking ledgers and listening to hard stories, and I learned to make decisions that would affect thousands of lives. There were nights of imposter syndrome so thick I wondered if I'd been a fraud from day one. There were mornings that filled my chest with a kind of fierce, protective joy so sharp I could barely breathe. Then, nearly a year after that bench, my past walked into my corner office. Clara, my quietly efficient right hand, knocked and said, "There are visitors downstairs. Your sister and Marcus Vale. No appointment." Marcus, my ex, the man who had left with a soft, rehearsed line about timing, stood beside Serena in the lobby, both looking as if they practiced humility in front of a mirror. Their faces were composed. Their smiles were worn like borrowed coats. Serena spoke first, voice trembling on purpose. "Rowan, we were wrong. We haven't been ourselves. We're sorry. For Christmas. For everything." She blinked slow tears and clasped her hands. Marcus nodded like a man who'd attended acting classes. "We're getting married," he added, quick to fill the sympathetic air. "We're trying to build things the right way now. We need help. Dad's investments went south. We might lose the house. Marcus' company needs bridge funding to close a seed round. $2 million should do it." I listened. My mouth didn't move. "Which part is life or death?" I asked. "Your father's mortgage or your valuation?" Marcus tried to laugh. "Rowan, please. You're doing fine now. This is family." His eyes begged for a small mercy he knew I could afford. I asked Claire to bring them into a small conference room and left a slim black folder on the table between us. Inside were bank statements and a spreadsheet, screenshots of social posts, and an article I'd had the foundation quietly acquire, a timeline of how the trust funds had been allocated. 87% gone in 11 months. Serena's face slipped. She called out, immediately reflexive, "We diversified. Crypto, NFTs, some angels. It was supposed to 10x. You bought Lamborghinis and paid influencers to shill tokens?" I said flatly, "That's not a downturn. That's arson with receipts. Where's the money?" They stammered. Marcus' smooth lines frayed. "We thought it would recover," he said. "We were told it was a bet with upside." I pushed the intercom and asked security to step in. "This foundation," I said, "exists for people who have nothing. It is not an ATM for people who burn their safety nets." Serena's face flushed scarlet. She pulled out her phone and hit record, the old habit of performing pain for an audience snapping into place. By the time 2 guards gently ushered them toward the elevator, someone had tipped off a gossip blogger. Paparazzi vans waited outside as though they'd been summoned by the story itself. Serena wept on cue. The video exploded online within an hour. A billionaire sister refusing to help. Family drama for the holidays. The cruelty of someone who had taken everything and still refused to hand back. The internet is a cruel town square. But the square is more dangerous when it remembers old sins. A nanny went on record. Serena's childhood antics. The time she blocked me out as a joke when rain poured down. Someone dug up an Instagram from that night and found the live stream. Serena had started as she watched me leave with my suitcase. The mood of the crowd shifted. The chorus of sympathy broke into a chorus of outrage. By midnight, the gossip had turned. Journalists tracked a seed deck and found that Marcus' startup was largely vapor. Promises and slides, no product. Investors ghosted. Contracts were canceled. Serena's wedding planner called to say the deposit hadn't cleared. Her follower count collapsed as people unfollowed in disgust. The world I'd left, the world of vanity and performance, folded on itself. The collapse of Pacific Capital stunned a Tuesday morning. News anchors said the word Ponzi in a whisper that made it sound like something biblical. My father had taken every remaining sum, mortgage, property, jewelry converted into funds, and moved it into a hideous scheme promising annual returns that read like a prayer. The founder fled. The FBI raided offices. Foreclosures marched toward doors. Within 30 days, the auction notice appeared on the mansion my parents had always called home. No buyers showed up. The bank took title. They moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment above a nail salon on Story Road, a place that smelled faintly of polish and desperation. Rent chewed out the last of what they had. They came to my office one rainy morning, damp and humbled and small. My father looked 20 years older. My mother's hair had been cut short and colored at a cheap salon. The pearls were gone. Serena clung to a knockoff tote like a life preserver. They begged. They asked for money. For the safety they had once taken for granted, I pushed a slim black folder across the table and placed 3 business cards on the polished wood. A certified financial planner who specialized in recovery. A free 8-week financial literacy and debt management program at an East San Jose community center, funded by the foundation. The number for a crisis hotline and a therapist who worked on sliding scale. This is what we offer strangers who poured everything into a lie or were robbed by one, I said. It's what we do for the people who walk through the foundation door with nothing. My father's hand trembled as he reached, then pulled back. After 32 years, that was all they could expect from their daughter. You had choices, I said. You rewrote the trust. You chased returns that smelled too sweet. You stayed silent when your child was humiliated. Those are your decisions. My mother's tears glistened. She said she was sorry. She said she had been wrong. I heard the apology. It sat like a thin bandage over a void. Being sorry doesn't rebuild. A life, I said quietly. Work does. Courage does. Taking responsibility does. Serena sobbed and accused me of enjoying their suffering. She wanted me to give money as punishment for the pain I'd felt. I walked to the door and held it open. No, I said. I won't bankroll the consequences of choices you made. Security escorted them out. They left broken and frightened. As the elevator doors closed, my mother whispered one last apology that reached me like a small wind. I held the folder and watched the rain streak down the window until the ache in my chest, the one that had never truly left since that bench, eased into something else. Not joy, exactly. Space, room to breathe. The work consumed me. We opened Second Harbor, an apartment campus born out of the idea that shelter needed to be stable, humane, and permanent. 4 stories of glass and redwood wrapped around a courtyard where rosemary and kale spilled into raised beds. 2,900 units had nothing I could point to as a miracle, but they had intent. On opening day, the plaza filled with people who would live there, donors, city officials, networks, and a marching band that warmed up like a heartbeat. I stood backstage, gray suit on, hands steady and heart pounding with something like an animal sense of readiness. Agatha, in. Winter White gave me a small nod from the front row. This was a project we had bled for. 200 permanent supportive apartments, on-site clinic, training centers, preschool, rooftop farm, and a policy that no person would be turned away for lack of paperwork. The mayor spoke. The crowd roared. When my name was called, near the back, almost hidden, I saw them. My father, my mother, Serena. Dad wore an old navy peacoat that hung off him the way a memory sometimes hangs on a body. Mom clutched a paper cup like it might vanish. Serena's hair was cropped plain, the armor of labels gone. I let a silence stretch for 3 slow seconds. 1 year ago tonight, I began, voice steady as if carved from something no storm could erode. I was thrown out of the only home I'd ever known with 1 suitcase and no place to go. I learned that night what it feels like when the people who are supposed to catch you let you fall. A ripple rolled through the crowd. Cameras leaned in. Then I told them what I had learned on the bench in the church garden, that family is not only blood. Family can be a hand that reaches when you are invisible. Family can be the stranger who sees you. This is Second Harbor, I said. 200 families will not sleep in their car tonight because a landlord raised the rent. Children will not do homework in the backseat because the utilities shut off. Every person who steps inside will be told what I needed to hear that Christmas Eve. You are not disposable. You are not alone. You are home. Applause rose and swelled like the tide. Phones rose too, the light of 1,000 little captures. I let the sound crest and then soften my voice so every microphone leaned forward. Tonight, we open these doors for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. Especially for those who were told that by the people who were supposed to love them the most. I looked right at them, right at that small group near the back. My father's shoulders trembled under his coat. My mother hid her face in her hands. Serena stared down, her gaze finding the floor as though it were a friend. I didn't smile. I didn't scowl. I held their eyes for a single heartbeat longer than comfort allowed and then stepped away from the podium. The ribbon was cut. The crowd surged forward. Children rushed with flowers. Reporters shouted questions I let roll off like rain. My family tried to cross the line into that flood of celebration. I kept walking. My mother reached out a hand that didn't touch me. My sister opened her mouth and closed it again, and for once said nothing at all. I moved through the people, not hurried, not slow, simply forward. The big redwood doors of Second Harbor opened as I approached and warm lights spilled across the concrete. The threshold felt like a promise. I crossed it. A little boy in a Spider-Man jacket tugged at my sleeve. "Are you the lady who built this place?" he asked, words simple and sure. I knelt so he and I were level. "I'm one of them," I said. He handed me a dandelion he'd found in the courtyard, a small, brave yellow thing. "For you," he declared, as if the world was obvious. I took the dandelion and, for the first time in a long time, smiled in a way that didn't need permission. Inside Second Harbor, the future began in the ordinary manner of miracles. A child's hand, a cup of tea shared in a new kitchen, a drying towel, a job application filled out, a nurse who remembered your name. My story did not end with a tidy revenge or a curse. It didn't end with my parents begging on street corners and me striding away like an avenging angel. It ended with work, long, hard, unglamorous work. The kind that doesn't translate into neat headlines, but translates into fewer people living in cars, fewer children going to bed hungry, fewer families forced into the street because someone's greed promised returns that never arrived. Agatha taught me to measure impact in years, not clicks. She taught me to be ruthless with waste and tender with people. Clara taught me how to keep my desk and my life in order. I watched board meetings where billionaires argued over definitions and learned that even the well-intentioned can be deaf. I argued with bureaucrats and slept on couches, and somewhere along the way I stopped being the girl who needed to be rescued. I became the woman who built a harbor. There were moments, of course, that felt like revenge without malice. Serena's live streams and public performances were scrubbed from the top of trending lists as the truth surfaced. People discovered the contracts Marcus had signed and the lines he had crossed. His company dissolved under the weight of due diligence. The man who had taken our father's money was arrested on a boat off an island. My parents lost the house and the trappings they had once owned, but they found, painfully, slowly, the small dignity of day-to-day life. They took the financial literacy course. My father went to therapy. My mother learned how to cook on a budget without shrieking at the economy of ingredients. I offered them the same ladder I offered anyone else, tools and a chance, but not a check to paper over their choices. Some people wanted absolution on demand. I learned that forgiveness is not an exchangeable currency. It is a practice. It is the decision to live in the world where one person can be both a father and a man who made wrong choices, and the daughter can refuse to bankroll the same errors. It is the quiet understanding that love and enabling are not the same thing. The days were full and ordinary. We opened clinics that kept people from ending up in emergency rooms for chronic issues. We funded training programs that turned layoffs into careers. We wrote grant briefs until they read like invitations instead of interrogations. We stood in classrooms where teenagers taught me how to speak their language and where veterans taught me how to listen. We kept our doors open when a mayor wanted to turn people away. We became stubborn. When I think back to the bench in the church garden, I realize that night was not about destiny so much as a compass. That woman who I had given my coat to, Agatha in disguise, or a woman made of paradox, taught me more than generosity. She taught me what it meant to be seen, and how that seeing could become a responsibility. She taught me that gifts should not be trophies, but tools. Years later, when I stood under the redwood doors and watched families come in, I understood a truth I had once learned the hard way. Losing a home does not make you less of a person. It reveals what systems have failed you. Being abandoned by Those who are supposed to love you does not mean you are unworthy of care. It simply means you must choose over and over how to answer when the world demands that you prove your worth. I chose to build a place where the proof was unnecessary. The boy in the Spider-Man jacket became a volunteer. The little dandelion I'd kept pressed between the pages of my journal turned into a drawing that hung in the lobby. Small, brave thing turned into a promise. The foundation grew, and with it, the network of people who refused to treat dignity as charity. My sister made mistakes, of course. She rebuilt herself in pieces, some days successfully, other days not. Marcus left quietly. My parents learned to live with smaller things and to speak apologies without expecting me to answer for them. We were not a family reassembled into some glossy image. We were a family that had been remade by hard work, by boundaries, and by the recognition that love does not mean bearing the consequences of every bad choice. When the cold creeps in now in December, I still think of that night and the sound of bare feet on concrete. I still remember the chance it gave me, the chance to decide who I wanted to be, in the quiet power of a single, small kindness offered without expectation. I still remember the smell of cheap motel cleaner and the way a 20-year-old bottle of champagne looked when you shared it with someone who had watched you give away your coat. Sometimes people ask me if I ever wanted to hurt my family back, to make them feel the scene cold. The answer is complicated. I wanted them to understand how sharp their decisions were. I wanted them to learn accountability, but I did not want them erased. What I wanted and what I built was a path forward that didn't require me to train my heart for victory. I wanted a place where someone could be honest about failure and get up the next morning and try again. That is what Second Harbor became. Not a monument to my leaving, but a doorway to arrival. If you ask me now whether I regret the way things happened, I will tell you this. Life's cruelties sharpen you if you let them, but only if you turn them into work. Giving away my coat that night was an instinctive act, a human act, not a calculated move. The rest was choice. I chose to lean into responsibility. I chose to learn the complicated language of money and policy. I chose to spend sleepless nights building systems that would outlast my impatience. And in the end, when the ribbon was cut and the children ran through the courtyard, I felt like someone who had finally come back to the table, not the old table of my parents' home, but a new table set for many, many more people. The doors of the foundation stayed open after the cameras left. People kept arriving, some with stories like my own, some with ones I could not have imagined. We found ways to make that first kindness, a coat wrapped around trembling shoulders, into something replicable, scalable, and humane. That is the truest kind of wealth, the capacity to give someone else a chance to be ordinary again. The rest, titles, money, social media storms, are ephemera. What stays is the work and the consequences, the small daily kindnesses that, when multiplied, build harbors for those who thought they had none. If you ever find yourself on a cold bench, for whatever reason, someone might pass you by. Maybe they will stop. Maybe they will smile. Maybe they will hand you a coat. Or maybe, and this is the cruel and tender truth, you will be the one to hand it to someone else. Either way, what matters is that we remember how to see one another. And when we build places to hold that seeing, we build a world where being thrown out is not the end of the story, but the first page of a new beginning.